today I'm willing, if you'll only take the shilling, to make a man of any one of you.
I feel I should start with an apology to Americans. You see, we British get very sniffy when you speak of a British accent as though there's only one. But the thing is, we're happy to commit the same crime by talking about an American accent as though there's only one of those two. So when a Brit makes an attempt at a Mississippi accent, the result probably won't be pretty. And I warn you, it's going to get worse in part 2 of this story when I paint myself into a real corner, when a Brit does a bad impression of an American doing a bad impression of a British accent. Don't be offended, I meant well. This is part 1 of the Miraumont Photographic Society. Considering we were taking photographs and developing them all day, every day, it's hard to see why we made such a mess of this one. You can't see me because I'm the chap holding the camera, not the chaps holding cameras in the picture, the one behind the camera that took the picture. And even that was a schmozzle. 3 of us took snaps. Mine was the only one that came out. Captain Stevens had first try. That's him with the fur collar in the front row, and it was him who'd picked up the camera. It was an RCA Bebe that he traded with a POW for a lighter that didn't work. Happy as a clown he was, until he discovered that none of our plates would fit. See, the thing was, we wanted a photograph of all of us, and the pictures we could get with a vest pocket Kodak were so blurred we might as well have stood the other side of the hut. The skipper thought he'd be able to get far enough back with a better camera and still see some detail. Now, you might think it funny that we couldn't take a photo, seeing as we had the world's supply of kit, but those big reconnaissance cameras needed to be halfway across the drome to get us all in. We tried, though, with them propped up on boxes and barrels, but it never seemed to work. And when we broke $500 worth of camera Type L aerial reconnaissance, the Major said we had to give it up. We were the 14th Photographic section. The Limey squadron up the road called us balloonatics, though we did have 2 airplanes as well. The Brits were pretty friendly, though they insisted on calling us Yanks, which didn't sit too well with people like me, whose granddaddy fought in the Civil War. So I called them all Jock in return, on account they all came from closer to Scotland than I did to Connecticut, but I don't think they got the point. Captain Stevens took me up in the de Havilland for a look around. He saw this column of German prisoners snaking back along the Louvencourt Road and had an idea. Well, I thought we were done for when the captain cut the engine and put the nose down. I'd only arrived the week before and I still wasn't too happy with that much daylight under me. Once the engine was quiet, the skipper shouted to me that we were landing, but I still spent the time making peace with my creator. And the prisoners, they can't have been that pleased either. They'd not had a good day and they'd probably been walking since dawn. When this crazy guy tries to land on their heads, they scattered into the ditches along with their guards, and we came down that road with scarcely a bounce. The captain was out of the front cockpit almost before we'd stopped rolling, and he grinned at me as he jumped down. "Germans," he said. "Like us." Why he thought this lot would be in possession of a camera you couldn't buy with a month's salary, I don't know. Most of them looked like they couldn't afford boots. He handed out cigarettes to the guards to apologize for frightening him half to death, and he went off in search of photographic treasure. Well, there were a lot of head shakes and shrugs, and nearly all of the Huns, there's about 20 of them, pointed to the cigarettes in his top pocket and made pleading faces. He was about to give up when a man in a slightly cleaner uniform than the rest nodded and took a tiny camera out of his hip case. It wasn't a Leica, but the skipper considered the mission a success when he traded it for that lighter that didn't work. He even gave the prisoners an unopened pack of Luckies to share out, though if they wanted to smoke them, they'd have to ask the guards for a match. Back at base, Stevens showed the camera to Brownie Peters, who actually looked vaguely interested in the captain's swag. Now, that was unusual for Brownie, who everybody said last smiled when William McKinley got shot. You can see him in the picture with the developer smudge on his head. I'll tell you more about that later. Brownie took the camera, which looked even smaller in his big, brown-stained hands. He was covered in blotches from the developing chemicals, and he always smelt like a funeral parlor. He grunted. RCA. Not bad. That was the most I'd heard Brownie say since I'd arrived. Sailor Francis, who was the nearest thing Brownie had to a friend, and being neighbours back home, always said that he'd only nodded when he made his marriage vows. I wondered if his wife was relieved he was away from home. Or if she'd noticed. The captain asked Brownie if he thought the camera was in full working order. Looks it. Got the plates. Brownie was feeling chatty tonight. No, but we must have hundreds. Not this size. Metric. The skipper let off a fair few unofficially comments at that, and he cursed the Germans to the worst hells he could design for them. He'd been shot at plenty by them, and that hadn't upset him nearly as much as swapping a camera with no film for a lighter with no flame. When he calmed down, he asked Brownie if it was possible to modify any of our plates to fit. Well, the shrug he got in reply could have meant anything, but the captain seemed satisfied. The next day I was about to go up in a balloon for the first time with Lieutenant Farmer. He's the stern-looking chap on the far left, standing next to the long camera. I'm damned if I can remember what sort it was. Yeah, actually, he was a real nice chap, and didn't seem to notice the difference between officers and the rest of us. A lot of the sergeants even called him Wilfred when the skip wasn't around, and that seemed to suit him fine. Though I never had the nerve to find out if corporals got the same privilege. We'd driven out the night before to maybe half a mile behind the lines, both of us sitting on the gas bag in the back of the truck. And when I turned in, they were just starting to gas her up. And there was all this fabric flapping around and making a noise in the wind that made me think the Germans would hear and blow us to hell before morning. But when I stuck my head out the tent just before sunup, it was hanging there like a big dark slug, with the wind making creases and dents in the tail fins. I was feeling pretty nervous, and when the lieutenant showed me how to strap on my parachute, I got the shakes bad enough that he had to do the buckles up for me. Well, the Huns started to get interested while we were still going up. It was a gusty morning, and we were swinging from side to side, so I was too busy hanging on to notice these whining noises that went by every couple of minutes. Then the lieutenant said, "You might want to keep your head down until we get higher," and I was ready to put in for a transfer to the Navy. We got up to maybe 5,000 feet, and the rifle fire died out, and we saw a bunch of enemy ack-ack guns that had no right to be there. They were painted grey, and sitting under grey sheets in a grey landscape. We were hanging in a brown basket under a silver balloon against a pink sky. It didn't take too much figuring to work out that they could see us too. Lieutenant Farmer told me to get the camera set up. I got hold of it. It weighed the best part of 20 pounds and threaded it out between the cables. The Huns weren't too happy about posing for their picture, and they started throwing flaming onions at us. You'd see these green balls of fire coming up at you, twisting around each other. Everybody said they didn't have to hit you. The wires holding them together would cut a blimp in half, they said. Well, I was flustered. The balloon was bouncing all over the map, and every anti-aircraft gun in France was pointed at me, and I dropped the damned camera. The lieutenant thought it was a huge joke, but I knew I was going to get it when we got down. So when we landed, I asked him what was liable to happen. He said a court-martial wasn't out of the question, but he'd put in a word, and hopefully they'd just stop it out of my pay. Yeah, then he slapped my arm and told me not to worry. We got shown into the major's office, and somebody must have already told him, because he did not look pleased. He stared at me for what seemed like about 5 minutes, puffing on his pipe. Then he said, "So, Corporal, how did you manage to drop a very expensive camera?" Before I could get a word out, Lieutenant Farmer cut in. "Sir, I'd like to commend Corporal Connor's bravery under heavy fire. Archie had our height to the inch, and the basket was hit several times by fragments. Connors remained standing throughout, taking photographs. He was reloading the plate when the camera itself was hit and destroyed. He was fortunately unhurt, but the camera was blown out of his hands. He did, however, make accurate sketches. Well, I couldn't have held a pencil even if I'd knowed what to draw, but he showed the Major his notepad with the sketches he'd made his own self while I was busy losing the camera. The Major looked at them and nodded.
Good work, Connors. You're new here, aren't you?
Arrived last Wednesday, sir.
Well, that's the right stuff, Connors. Lieutenant, I think it appropriate for you to stand your observer a drink in the officer's mess.
Well, of course it was me who ended up buying for both of us, but I got to have my drink in the officer's mess. And I got to call the lieutenant Wilfred.
But on Saturday I'm willing if you'll only take the shilling to make a